Hey there, ready for another chapter of Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator? We're going to do chapter 18, The Oldest Person in the World, page 135. I'll give you a second to turn to that page. Okay then, here we go. We return in triumph, Charlie, cried Mr. Wonka as the Great Glass Elevator began to slow down. Once more your dear family will be all together again. The elevator stopped. The door slid open, and there was the chocolate room and the chocolate river and the Oompa Loompas in the middle of it, and in the middle of it all the great bed belonging to the old grandparents. Charlie, said Grandpa Joe, rushing forward, thank heaven you're back. Charlie hugged him, and then he hugged his mother and father. Is she here? He said. Grandma Georgina? Nobody answered. Nobody did anything except Grandpa Joe, who pointed to the bed. He pointed, but he didn't look where he was pointing. None of them looked at the bed except Charlie. He walked past them all to get a better view, and he saw at one end the two babies, Grandma Josephine and Grandpa George, both tucked in and sleeping peacefully. And at the other end, don't be alarmed, said Mr. Wonka, running up and placing a hand on Charlie's arm. She's bound to be just a teeny bit overplussed. I warned you about that. What have you done to her? Cried Mrs. Bucket. My poor old mother. Propped up against the pillows on the other end of the bed was the most extraordinary thing Charlie had ever seen. Was it some ancient fossil? It couldn't be that because it was moving slightly, and now it was making sounds, croaking sounds, the kind of sounds a very old frog makes if it knew only a few words. Well, 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 it croaked. If it isn't dear Charlie. Grandma, cried Charlie. Grandma Georgina. Oh, oh, oh. Her face was like a pickled walnut. There were such masses of creases and wrinkles that the mouth and the eyes and even the nose were sunken in almost out of sight. Her hair was pure white, and her hands, which were resting on top of the blanket, were just little lumps of wrinkly skin. The presence of this ancient creature seemed to have terrified not only Mr. and Mrs. Bucket, but Grandpa Joe as well. They stood well back away from the bed. Mr. Wonka, on the other end, was happy as ever. My dear lady, he cried, advancing to the edge of the bed and clasping one of those wrinkled hands in both of his. Welcome home, and how are you feeling on this bright and glorious day? Not too bad, croaked Grandma Georgina. Not too bad, considering my age. Good for you, said Mr. Wonka. Atta girl. Well, all we've got to do now is find out exactly how old you are. Then we should be able to take further action. You're taking no further action around here, said Mrs. Bucket, tight-lipped. You've done enough damage already. But my dear old muddle-headed mugwump, said Mr. Wonka, turning to Mrs. Bucket, what does it matter that the old girl has become a trifle too old? We can put that back right in a jiffy. Have you forgotten about Wonkavite and how every tablet makes you 20 years younger? We shall bring her back. We shall transform her into a blushing maiden in the twinkle of an eye. What good is that when your husband's not even out of diapers yet? Wailed Mrs. Bucket, pointing a finger at the 1-year-old Grandpa George, so peacefully sleeping. Madam, said Mr. Wonka, let us do one thing at a time. I forbid you to give her that beastly Wonkavite, said Mrs. Bucket. You'll turn her into a minus again just as sure as I'm standing here. I don't want to be a minus, croaked Grandma Georgina. If I ever have to go back to that beastly minus land again, the Newlies will griddle me. Fear not, said Mr. Wonka. This time I myself will supervise the giving of the medicine. I shall personally see to it that you get the correct dosage. But listen very carefully now. I cannot work out how many pills to give you until I know exactly how old you are. That's obvious, isn't it? It's not obvious at all, said Mrs. Bucket. Why can't you just give her one pill at a time and play it safe? Impossible, madam. In very serious cases such as this, Wonkavite doesn't work at all when given in small doses. You've got to throw everything at her in one go. You've got to hit her with it hard. A single pill wouldn't even begin to shift her. She's gone too far for that. It's all or nothing. No, said Mrs. Bucket firmly. Yes, said Mr. Wonka. Dear lady, please listen to me. If you have a very severe headache and you need 3 aspirins to cure it, it's no good taking one at a time and waiting 4 hours between each. You'll never cure yourself that way. You've got to gulp them all down in one go. It's the same with Wonkavite. May I please proceed? Oh, all right. I suppose you have to, said Mrs. Bucket. Good, said Mr. Wonka, giving a little jump and twirling feet in the air. Now then, how old are you, my dear Grandma Georgina? I don't know, she croaked. I lost count of that years and years ago. Don't you have any idea? Said Mr. Wonka. Of course I don't, gibbered the old woman. Nor would you if you were as old as I am. Think, said Mr. Wonka. You've got to think. The tiny old wrinkled brown walnut face wrinkled itself more than ever. The others stood in waiting. Oompa Loompas, enthralled by the sight of this ancient object, were edging closer and closer to the bed. The two babies slept on. Are you, for example, 100, or 110, or 120? It's no good, she croaked. I never did have a head for numbers. This is a catastrophe, cried Mr. Wonka. If you can't tell me how old you are, I can't help you. I dare not risk an overdose. Gloom settled upon the entire company, including for once Mr. Wonka himself. You messed it up good and proper this time, haven't you? Said Mrs. Bucket. Grandma, Charlie said, moving forward to the bed. Listen, Grandma, don't worry about exactly how old you might be. Try to think of a happening instead. Think of something that happened to you, anything you like, as far back as you can. It may help us. Lots of things happened to me, Charlie. So many things happened to me. But can you remember any of them, Grandma? Oh, I don't know, my darling. I suppose I could remember one or two if I thought hard enough. Good, Grandma, good, said Charlie eagerly. Now, what is the earliest thing you can remember in your whole life? Oh, my dear boy, that would be really going back a few years, wouldn't it? When you were little, Grandma, like me, can you remember anything you did when you were little? The tiny sunken black eyes glimmered faintly, and a sort of smile touched the corners of an almost invisible little slit in her mouth. There was a ship, she said. I can remember a ship. I could never forget that ship. Go on, Grandma. A ship? What sort of ship? Did you sail on her? Of course I sailed in her, my darling. We all sailed in her. Where from? Where to? Charlie went on eagerly. Oh, no, I couldn't tell you that. I was just a tiny little girl. She lay back on the pillow and closed her eyes. Charlie watched her, waiting for something more. Everybody waited. Nobody moved. It had a lovely name, that ship. There was something beautiful, so beautiful about that name. But of course I couldn't possibly remember it. Charlie, who had been sitting on the edge of the bed, suddenly jumped up, his face shining with excitement. If I said the name, Grandma, would you remember it then? I might, Charlie. Yes, I think I might. The Mayflower, cried Charlie. The old woman's head jerked up off the pillow. That's it, she croaked. You've got it, Charlie. The Mayflower. Such a lovely name. Grandpa, Charlie called out, dancing with excitement. What year did the Mayflower sail? The Mayflower sailed out of Plymouth Harbor on September 6, 1620, said Grandpa Joe. Plymouth, croaked the old woman. That rings a bell. Yes, it might easily have been Plymouth. 1620, cried Charlie. Oh, my heavens above. That means you do it, Grandpa. Well, now, said Grandpa Joe, take 1620 away from 1972, and that leaves... Oh, don't rush me now, Charlie. That leaves 352. Jumping jackrabbits, yelled Mr. Bucket. She's 352 years old. She's more, said Charlie. How old did you say you were, Grandma, when you were on the Mayflower? Were you about 8? I think I was even younger than that, my darling. I think I was only a bitty girl, probably no more than 6. Then she's 358, gasped Charlie. That's Vita-Wonk for you, said Mr. Wonka proudly. I told you that's powerful stuff. 358, said Mr. Bucket. It's unbelievable. Just imagine the things she must have seen in her lifetime, said Grandpa Joe. My poor old mother, wailed Mrs. Bucket. What on earth? Patience, dear lady, said Mr. Wonka. Now comes the interesting part. Bring on the Wonkavite. And Oompa Loompa ran forward with a large bottle and gave it to Mr. Wonka. He put it on the bed. How young does she want to be? He asked. 78, said Mrs. Bucket firmly, exactly where she was before this nonsense started. Surely she'd like to be a little younger than that. said Mr. Wonka. Certainly not, said Miss Bucket. It's too risky. Too risky, croaked Grandma Georgina. You'll only minus me again if you try to be clever. Have it your way, said Mr. Wonka. Now then, I've got to do a few sums. Another Oompa Loompa trotted forward, holding up a blackboard. Mr. Wonka took a piece of chalk in his pocket, and he wrote. Present age of the person, 358. Age she wants to be, subtract this, 78. Number of years younger she must become, 280. If each Wonkavite makes you 20 years younger, we must divide 280 by 20 to find out how many pills to give, which totals out to 14 pills. 14 pills of Wonkavite exactly, said Mr. Wonka. The Oompa Loompa took the blackboard away. Mr. Wonka picked up the bottle from the bed and opened it and counted out 14 of the little brilliant yellow pills. Water, he said. Another Oompa Loompa ran forward with a glass of water. Mr. Wonka tipped all 14 pills into the glass. The water bubbled and frothed. Drink it while it's fizzing, he said, holding the glass up to Grandma Georgina's lips, all in one gulp. She drank it. Mr. Wonka sprang back and took a large brass clock from his pocket. Don't forget, he cried, it's a year a second. She's got 280 years to lose. That'll take her 4 minutes and 40 seconds. Watch the centuries fall away. The room was so silent that they could hear the ticking of Mr. Wonka's clock. At first, nothing much happened to the ancient person lying on the bed. She closed her eyes and lay back. Now and again, the puckered skin on her face gave a twitch, and her little hands jerked up and down. But that was all. 1 minute gone, called Mr. Wonka. She's 60 years younger. She looks the same to me, said Mr. Wonka. Of course she does, said Mr. Wonka. What's a mere 60 years when you're over 300 to start with? Are you all right, Mother? Said Mrs. Bucket anxiously. Talk to me, Mother. 2 minutes gone, said Mr. Wonka. She's 120 years younger. And now definite changes were beginning to show in the old woman's face. The skin was quivering all over, and some of the deepest wrinkles were becoming less and less deep. The mouth less sunken, the nose more prominent. Mother, cried Mrs. Bucket, are you all right? Speak to me, Mother, please. Suddenly, with a suddenness that made everyone jump, the old woman sat bolt upright in bed and said, We've beaten them. Yorktown surrendered. We've kicked out those dirty British. She's going crazy, said Mr. Wonka. Not at all, said Mr. Wonka. She's going through the 18th century. 3 minutes gone, said Mr. Wonka. Every second now she was growing slightly less and less shriveled, becoming more and more lively. It was a marvelous thing to watch. Gettysburg, she cried. General Lee is on the run. A few seconds later she let out a great wail of anguish and said, He's dead, he's dead, he's dead. Who's dead? Said Mr. Bucket, craning forward. Lincoln, she wailed. There goes the train. She must have seen it, said Charlie. She must have been there. She is there, said Mr. Wonka. At least she was a few seconds ago. Will someone please explain this to me, said Mrs. Bucket. What on earth? 4 minutes gone, said Mr. Wonka. Only 40 seconds left. Only 40 more years to lose. Grandma, cried Charlie, running forward. You're looking almost exactly like you used to. Oh, I'm so glad. Just so long as it stops when it's meant to, said Mrs. Bucket. I bet it doesn't, said Mr. Bucket. Something always goes wrong. Not when I'm in charge of it, sir, said Mr. Wonka. Time's up. She's now 78 years old. How do you feel, dear lady? Is everything all right? I feel tolerable. Just tolerable. But that's no thanks to you, you meddling old mackerel. There she was again, the same cantankerous, grumbling old Grandma Georgina that Charlie had come to know well before it all started. Mrs. Bucket flung her arms around her and began weeping with joy. The old woman pushed her aside and said, What, may I ask, are those two silly babies on the other end of the bed? One of them's your husband, said Mr. Bucket. Rubbish, she said. Where is George? I'm afraid it's true, Mother, said Mrs. Bucket. That's him on the left. The other one's Josephine. You chiseling old cheeseburger, she shouted, pointing a fierce finger at Mr. Wonka. What in the name of? Now, said Mr. Wonka. Let us not, for mercy's sake, have another row so late in the day. If everyone will keep their hair on, and leave this to Charlie and me, we shall have them exactly where they used to be in the flick of a fly's wing. And that ends chapter 18. Tomorrow we'll do chapter 19, titled The Babies Grow Up. And we'll pick up on page 146. In the meantime, rest well, and I'll see you tomorrow night.